technical issues. It gives me great pleasure to present David Rees Jones from the University of Oxford, who's going to talk to us about mushy layers.
Okay, so the sort of system I'm thinking about is formed when a liquid which contains two components, at least two components, is cooled beneath its freezing temperature. And I thought I'd start off by showing a video of a laboratory experiment where that was done. So this is a salt solution. This is a layer of solid beneath its eutectic temperature. This is a partially molten layer containing liquid in the interstices of a solid matrix, and this is a purely liquid region. And the experiment is run where this solidification device is pulled between a cold and a warm heat exchanger, creating a temperature gradient. And it's pulled at a prescribed rate, which is varied over the course of the experiment. So let's have a look. You'll see a little bit of compositional convection in the liquid region. The experimentally prescribed solidification rate slows during the experiment, and that causes the mushy layer to grow. And what I want you to focus on is the production of these plumes from what are liquid regions inside the mushy layer. And this is caused by an internal process of convection, which happens inside the mushy layer, and it's one of the main ways in which these systems segregate, leading to sort of macroscopic segregation, where this sort of bulk composition of this region changes over the course of the experiment, and microscopic segregation. If this experiment were suddenly to be stopped, you would see this structure frozen into the solid.
Could you say something about the densities?
Of the liquid and solid.
And when you take the solid out of the liquid, does it get denser or lighter?
So in this case, it's getting lighter, which is why things are rising up.
The liquid gets lighter.
The residual liquid gets lighter when the solid is removed. Yeah. So that's the only thing in this talk which is going to be that way up. So every other time, gravity is going to be the other way up in some sense. So yes, for the rest of the talk, when the solid forms, a denser component is going to be rejected and things are going to go the other way, at least in nearly everything, I think.
And you're going to cool it from on top, right?
Yes. There might be a few slides where that convention is reversed depending on the context, but that's basic.
Keep us on our toes.
So I'll try and flag up when gravity's changing sign. So sort of to give an outline of the talk, I'm going to talk through a few examples of where these kind of mushy layers form in an environment. I'm going to talk about some of the physics of these systems and how the equations we can use to describe it. Then the main part of the talk is going to be to discuss convection in these systems, to look at some of the stability analysis which has been done to look at numerical solutions of the equations governing convection in these systems. I'm going to talk about something I did, which is to describe this system in a sort of half analytical way, and talk about the affection of passive tracers through these systems, and how that's a sort of test of some of the modelling which was done. Then if there's time, I'll talk about some of the application I've used this modelling in terms of trying to develop simple descriptions of salt fluxes in sea ice. In sea ice, you might be interested in that. Sea ice is ice which is formed from salt water, and the salt keeps the ice porous as it forms. Oceanographers are interested in trying to understand salt fluxes from sea ice, because this is one of the main buoyancy forcings of the polar oceans. And then some conclusions. So a few different examples. So first of all, I'll show a picture of a mushy layer. So I define a mushy layer as a reactive, multi-phase porous media. And reaction is going to be important in these systems. And it's formed as a result of, so you'll see this picture of a mushy layer. It has a very complicated internal structure that's formed as a result of morphological or shape of the interface instability. And that's driven by supercooling and resisted by interfacial energy. Such supercooling is sometimes thought to occur at the boundary between the inner and outer core. So this is for solidus temperature, and this is for adiabat, and this region here is thought to be supercooled. And from seismic grounds, we think this region must be rather thin if it exists. So some people think there's a mushy layer at the inner core boundary. Mushy layers also form in geologic systems. So this is a dike which is solidified, so igneous intrusion. Mushy layers also form in magma chambers, and here's an example when gravity is going up and the light component is being released. So this is sort of vertical profiles at the base of a solidifying magma chamber. So this is some temperature below the technic temperature. This is a fully crystallized rock and a mushy layer. And here is the liquid density profile, so it's increasing, and that can drive convection within this mushy zone. So the basic mechanism proposed by this paper by Chopin involves the downward flow through the bulk of this mushy layer and localized upward flow in high permeability zones. And you'll see that this is the same sort of picture which is going to emerge when I think about convection in sea ice. So here's a picture of sea ice. So from above it looks sort of fairly flat and boring. These regions are ridges caused by sea ice flows being pushed together by sort of wind. But if you look inside sea ice, there's stuff going on right down to a tiny scale. So this is an MRI scan showing the liquid intrusions inside sea ice. The colour scale is for liquid fraction. And there's something going on at the top, probably due to how the sample is prepared. But what I want to draw your attention to is this vertical structure, which is a sort of brine drainage network at the base of this piece of ice. So this region has much higher liquid content. As well as this sort of defined structure, there's also liquid sort of everywhere in the porous matrix, and that liquid is kept liquid by the presence of salt, which is trapped in the ice when it forms. And these brine drainage networks are extremely important in getting the salt out of the ice. And one of the main goals of this work is to try and quantify how fast that salt gets out of the ice. So, sort of show a few different pictures to motivate stuff. This is a photograph of the bottom of ice. So you'll see that these are the ends of ice crystals. The darker regions are liquid. As well as this sort of microstructure, there's also larger macroscopic liquid regions called brine channels. So here's a brine channel. It's got a diameter of about 3 millimeters. Depends on the conditions, but it's sort of a typical size. If you look from the side, you'll see that the brine channels are vertical, roughly vertical, a bit like we saw in that MRI scan. And you can just about make out that there's some liquid coming at the bottom, from the bottom of those brine channels. That's a little bit clearer if you look at a shallow graph of the same sort of experiment. So these streamers are streamers of dense, cold salt water, which are coming out of the bottom of the ice. And as the experiment evolves, the salt eventually sort of starts to accumulate in the tank. And you can measure the average salinity of the tank, and that gives you a measure of how much salt has been lost by the mushy layer over the course of the experiment. So the sort of mechanism is as follows. So in this situation, the salt water is solidified from above. Solid ice is essentially purely water. So the salt is what's being rejected into the liquid phase. So the liquid phase becomes concentrated in salt. Salt is relatively dense, and so that sets off compositional convection within the ice and the formation of these brine channels. So the answer that we're going to come to about what's the role of convection in mushy layers is it can change the microstructure and cause chemical segregation. It has some thermal role, but that's going to play less of a role in this talk. So the sort of basic physics of these systems. So these aqueous systems are basically eutectic systems. So above a certain temperature, freezing temperature, you get purely liquid. Below that liquidus temperature, you get a mixture of liquid and solid. But then there's some temperature called eutectic temperature below which you'll get a composite. So if I was to plot the solidus curve on this diagram, it would basically be this axis. As far as anyone can measure, no salt is incorporated into the solid phase. So to sort of discuss this picture again in light of this curve, if we consider one of the solid crystals here, that has a salinity of 0 and it's at some temperature. And one of the things we're going to assume is that the liquid and the solid are at the same temperature, so there's a very high internal surface area, and the interface would move, or the internal interfaces would grow or melt to achieve local equilibrium. So any liquid in the gaps would be at the freezing temperature. And then we're going to consider a patch which contains both liquid and solid, and that's at some intermediate bulk salinity and at the same uniform temperature. And that's what we call a mushy layer. So the sort of equations which govern these systems are, in the sort of continuum approximation, are as follows. So we have a temperature equation. So T is for temperature, U is for Darcy velocity, and a sort of extra term due to phase change is this term here on the right. So L is a latent heat term, and phi is a solid fraction, in contrast to much of the magma dynamics literature. So salt conservation, so salt is transported through, we only really need to consider salt conservation in the liquid phase, so that's what this equation shows, and again, there's a sink or source term associated with phase change. It's usually the case that we neglect the density difference between the phases, apart from in the buoyancy term. So the third equation of mass conservation is usually taken as that the fluid is incompressible. Okay, and this liquidus condition, so the temperature and the interstitial salinity are linked through some liquidus relationship, which for most of the talk we're going to take as being linear. So that means that in terms of the structure of this thing, this second equation, which looks like an equation for C, is really an equation for phi, because T is controlled to a large extent by the first equation. It's a sort of coupled system, but you can understand the real physics of what's going on by thinking of this as an equation for the temperature, and this is an equation for the solid fraction, and they're coupled by the second one telling you how much latent heat is released as the thing solidifies. And then finally there's some equation of state, which we're going to take to be a linear function of the composition and temperature. And the dominant non-dimensional parameter in this system, at least as far as convection goes, is a Rayleigh number. And I've got a diagram on the next slide which explains what some of these terms are. Okay, so think about convection in mushy layers. This is sort of goes back to the 90s, early 90s, maybe late 80s too. And what I've done is I've plotted, so it's a mushy layer being solidified from above. The temperature starts off cold at the top and increases downwards. The interstitial concentration goes exactly the other way in the mushy layer, and then there's a sort of narrow compositional boundary there where it takes its far field value. Now I plot the liquidus temperature associated with that concentration. Looks a little bit like this. And if you put all that together, you get a density profile which is unstable in the mushy layer and unstable in the compositional boundary layer. And this beta delta C is essentially or rho naught beta delta C is a density difference across the mushy layer, goes into the Rayleigh number. K naught is the permeability, and we're considering systems which solidify at a constant rate H dot, which gives a slightly unusual form of a Rayleigh number. Eta is a kinematic viscosity of the liquid phase.
Are you ignoring the thermal expansion coefficient?
Yes, so beta star incorporates something to do with composition and something to do with temperature. And if the liquidus is linear, then you can sort of lump them all in the same coefficient. So it depends a little bit on the geometry, but in this situation they both work together, and beta star is slightly enhanced by the thermal expansion, but it's mostly composition. Okay, so these two unstable sort of features of the density profile give rise to two modes of instability. So this is critical Rayleigh number as a function of wave number, and these graphs do depend on some of the other non-dimensional parameters in the system. So this is not some universal curve, but this is a sort of typical plot. This high wave number mode corresponds to a short wavelength of the instability, and that corresponds to an instability of this boundary layer. So here's the mush and here's the liquid region, and you see this boundary layer mode is associated with the compositional boundary layer. That's not really something we're very interested in because the mushy layer is almost incidental to this, apart from it's a slightly odd boundary condition. What we're really interested in is the other mode of instability, which is called the mushy layer mode, and in here the streamlines associated with the instability penetrate into the mushy layer significantly, and you get a circulation. And that circulation changes the porosity field, so a little bit like this. So the key thing is, in regions where liquid is flowing from, material is moving from the liquid region towards the mush, so upwards, you're going from a region which, at least as far as the interstitial liquid is, relatively fresh to relatively salty. So if you're bringing relatively fresh liquid in, you're reducing the bulk composition. So if you remember my liquidus diagram earlier, it must mean that you're increasing the solid fraction, so that's the darker regions here. Conversely, if you're moving down, the opposite happens, and you're bringing in more salt, and that's dissolving the matrix. So in upwelling regions, you get a higher solid fraction, and in downwelling regions, you get a lower solid fraction. So so that is going to be key to developing liquid channels as follows. So in the downwelling region, you have increased liquid fraction, reduced solid fraction, increased liquid fraction. That's going to increase the local permeability, so it reinforces this downward flow, and conversely, the upwelling in the away from these downwelling regions is reduced by increasing solid fraction. So that's a mechanism which localizes the flow into these developed channels, which in a fully developed system are purely liquid. So another thing that was noticed is that this convection has a hexagonal planform, and weakly nonlinear stability analysis can predict this planform of convection, but it can't tell you anything about this fully nonlinearly developed system where you get channels. For that, we need either a more complex analysis or some numerics. So to go back to these equations, we can understand most of the sort of most important features of these equations by simplifying them in the following way. So we can combine these first two equations together, at least in some limit, into this combined heat equation, or effective heat equation, where omega is some effective heat capacity which is enhanced by the latent heat release. I've replaced the time derivatives with z derivatives moving in a frame with the interface. In 2 dimensions, we can combine these equations by taking the curl of this equation to obtain a vorticity equation. Psi is the 2-dimensional stream function, and this is the Rayleigh number we discussed earlier. So similar equations have been solved numerically, and some of the challenges in doing so are to do with this free boundary between the liquid region and the solid region. So this, for the first attempt at this, rather than determining this free boundary problem, it solved it just at one point, halfway through the domain. The liquid region below is complicated, so they sort of approximated its role by assuming a thin thermal boundary layer, which was sort of parameterized. A later paper did solve this free boundary problem, and also tried to deal with the liquid region by solving Stokes equations for the flow in the liquid region. This was quite unsatisfactory because lots of the computational effort had to be expended in solving the liquid region equations, which they weren't interested in for its own sake. Sort of more recent numerics sort of combine some of the best features of these and has been able to solve quite a reasonably wide parameter space, at least in 2D, for a periodic array of chimneys at steady state. I'm going to show you a slightly different approach, and this is the sort of basic physical picture which I'm going to attempt to model. Cold on top, warm on beneath, and this is a sort of self-sustained process, but I'm going to start my explanation in one place. So if there's cold liquid flowing down a channel, it's bringing material which is relatively cold from above. That relative coldness is conducted into the mushy layer to the side, setting up a horizontal temperature gradient. And that drives a baroclinic or a vortical flow as indicated by these blue lines, bringing in material which replaces the material which is going down the channel. So you can see that effect in this vorticity equation. The vorticity is driven by horizontal gradients. And so the sort of model we're going to develop, to zoom in a little bit, we're just going to look at half of the domain by symmetry, and we're going to divide up our mushy layer into 3 regions. So there's some region where no fluid flow happens, so we're not really going to be very interested in that region. We're going to simplify things by considering a passive region. I need to assume that this horizontal temperature gradient only happens in a limited space relatively near the brine channel. So outside of that, we're going to assume that the temperature, which in non-dimensional units is theta, is horizontally uniform and also vertically linear. The consistent solution of the fluid flow is that of a corner flow. So X is for horizontal position, L is for spacing between the chimneys, and Z is positive downwards. Near the chimney, we need to worry about horizontal structure. In order to simplify things, we're going to look for a solution which has the same vertical structure as the passive outer region, if you like, but has a similar structure near the brine channel, introducing this rescaled version of horizontal position, where the rescaling depends on the Rayleigh number. Okay, so once we've done this, we substitute these expressions into our governing equations, and we produce ordinary differential equations which we can solve to describe the flow we get. So sort of ultimate goal is to work out how much flux is coming down the channel, and we can do that by solving these ordinary differential equations. We need to worry a little bit about boundary conditions at the channel. Here we just use symmetry boundary conditions, so it's quite straightforward. At the channel, we're going to exploit the narrowness of the channel and basically use a lubrication approximation to solve the Navier-Stokes equations and a heat conservation equation, a salt conservation equation in the channel. So with that, we can get some equations which are essentially boundary conditions for the channel. And just from looking at the boundary conditions, we can predict scalings for the size of the channel, and also that they should be independent of depth, which means that the channels will be straight-sided, just like we saw in the some of those experimental slides at the beginning. An equation for heat conservation, so lateral conduction is balanced by downward advection, and a thermodynamic condition which constrains the size of the channel. And this sort of boundary between the active region and the passive region is determined by conserving everything you might want to conserve. That's that boundary. So that sets up some ordinary differential equations, which are easy to solve, and you get some temperature, which increases away from the cold chimney, and some vertical velocity, which decreases away from the chimney, and it's positive near the chimney, and negative far away. Fine. So if we were interested in the flux, 2 things to notice about the flux and how it depends on what I've called the active region width, which is related to the spacing between the brine channels. Firstly, there's a minimum width that you need in order to sustain convective flow, which turns out to be pi upon 2 in scaled units. So that's essentially saying that the chimneys need to be sufficiently far apart in order to sustain this kind of convective flow. There's also a unique maximum of a flux with respect to active region width, or equivalently with respect to spacing between the channels, and Andrew Wells suggested that the spacing between channels might adjust in order to achieve this maximum flux. So there's no direct evidence for this hypothesis yet.
Which way is the flux?
Which
The flux has a direction
So it's total flux downwards.
downwards.
Yeah.
And it's positive downwards.
So this is a positive flux of salt out of the mushy layer. It's always has, so the sign is always positive in this situation because of the density gradient being prescribed. So if you make this hypothesis, it simplifies life considerably because the solid flux is proportional to the Rayleigh number, and the only thing that's left is some nonlinear function of this heat capacity, omega. If you want to, you can find an asymptotic solution for the case of large omega. And the only one reason to do this is that the equations have the structure of a damped nonlinear oscillator, and you can prove that there is a unique maximum flux, there's a minimum, this pi by 2 drops out nicely, and you can show that at high omega the solid flux is proportional to 1 over omega, which agrees with the numerics. So that means that convection is reduced by having a large amount of latent heat associated with phase change. So if latent heat is very important, then that buffers the system against convection transporting all the salt out. And the sort of aqueous salt solutions, the sort of relevant range of omega is sort of about 10. So this high omega limit is actually sort of interesting from a practical point of view as well. And the whole sort of result agreed with numerics, which were done almost at the same sort of time. This is plotted against 1 over omega, so expect a straight line, and the slope of this line corresponds to the slope of this line. So it was all quite satisfactory. One thing that we could do that isn't yet possible numerically is to look at things in 3D. So this is, again, this is one of these experiments, and this is the sort of result of running our model. You can see I've flipped the axes with a prescribed plan form. And this, you can see qualitatively, you produce similar sort of vertical structure, which is the sort of the effect of these brine channels. So the way we go about constructing this model is to assume that the channel and the active region are axisymmetric. We allow the passive region to have whatever shape is determined by the sort of drainage network of these channels. Because the passive region is so simple, it just boils down to solving the Laplace's equation in that passive region, we can tackle this problem too. And in terms of results, one sort of interesting feature which emerges is previously we found the solid flux was proportional to the Rayleigh number, and this proportionality doesn't occur in axisymmetry. So these curves are not straight lines. And a new parameter has entered the system, which is this, essentially this is related to the width of the channels. So in planar geometry, convection doesn't care about how big the channels are. That's sort of set internally. It doesn't really, the sort of outer flow doesn't know anything about how big the channels are. That's not the case in axisymmetry, and that's geometric as the flow is constricted near the channel. Okay, so this is sort of, we can use the infection of tracers to test these ideas. So this is some experiments from the 70s. What the experimenters did, they grew some ice, then after it had grown a bit, they injected dye into the liquid underneath, and they observed its what they called uniform entrainment of dye into the ice. And they measured the position of the dye front as a function of time. So, and they fitted these exponential curves, but said they didn't have a theory to explain this. And if you look at the sea ice literature about these brine channels, the sort of overriding impression you get is that the flow is all internal to the brine channel. There's no sense that the water which is coming out the bottom must have come from somewhere. And where it's coming from is this uniform entrainment, which had been observed quite a long time ago. I expect if they're taught to people who worked on mushy layers in the 1980s, they might have found an explanation. But we could do slightly more, because we now had a model for W. And one thing that drops out of the reduced modelling I discussed earlier is that the vertical velocity is linear in the position Z. So if we put that in, V we also have an expression for in terms of some Rayleigh number, and that gives us this exponential progress of the diaphragm, which was quite nice. So that's the first half of the talk done. I want to talk maybe a little bit more briefly about how that applies to sea ice modelling. So sea ice models are used in climate models are complicated beasts which attempt to account for both thermodynamic effects and what are called dynamic effects due to the large-scale movement of the ice by the wind and ocean currents. Now, the dynamic part is extremely complicated. Rather simpler is the thermodynamic part, and the reason it's simpler is that, by and large, especially in the winter, the growth and melting of ice is essentially a 1D thing. Eventually, as the ice breaks up, it melts from the side, but by and large, if you have a large ice pack, much of what happens is just grows up, just grows down or melts up, or melts from the surface, and it's all a sort of 1D thing. At least this is a reasonable way of thinking about things in the winter. Now, the sort of standard climate model type of representation of this process is that you have some temperature field through the ice. So what's under here is treated by a different part of the model. But within the ice, you have some temperature field. It's discretized with some small number of points. You have some boundary conditions which determine this temperature at the top and the temperature at the bottom set by the liquidus temperature of the salinity of the seawater. And you solve a heat equation. And these heat capacity and thermal conductivity depend on the temperature and salinity. And what's normally done is that the bulk salinity is a prescribed number, usually a constant. Our contribution is to add a salinity field which varies in space and time, and determine its evolution by considering this what was called an entrainment of water into the ice, resulting from convection. So we gain an extra term in the heat equation, which turns out to be small. More importantly, we've now got a salt conservation equation, and here this term desalinates the ice over time. And these heat capacities are now sort of dynamically determined as part of the model, so they vary over the course of a growth season. Okay, so this is the sort of thing you get. So these are snapshots over 20 days of growth of ice. This is for temperature. This is for salinity, so you see it sort of, this is its initial salinity, 35, the same as the ocean, and then it desalinates over time down to some level, which depends on the details of the model. And this is the solid fraction, so gradually the solid fraction increases to around 90%. So to test this model, we looked at some sort of experiments which were done in the laboratory. So these experiments are the same ones we saw at the start. You've got a fixed cold plate, and you've got a warm bath of melt water in which you're growing into. And this set of experiments seem to produce less ice than other experiments at nominally the same conditions. So there are things about these experiments which we don't completely understand. So this slight discrepancy between model and experiment could be about as much to do with the experiments as the modelling. This side is sort of just for completeness. The sort of more interesting or new side is this representation of the salinity of the tank. So the salinity of the tank, if you think about it, is a measure of the cumulative salt flux you're getting out of the ice. So this is what we really want to get a handle on for the oceanographers. So for these different conditions with the same model, we can, roughly speaking, fit all of these points. One discrepancy occurs at relatively early times when we don't get the initial onset of convection right. That's a little bit surprising because we thought the onset of convection had been sort of solved in the 1990s. The next two slides are a slightly complicated attempt to offer an explanation of what's going on. And the key is the permeability of sea ice, which is not very well known. So one approach is, let's assume we all agree with the linear stability analysis and that the onset of convection is governed by a critical rating number. So we'll take that as sort of more certain than our knowledge of the permeability of sea ice and use that hypothesis to infer the permeability of sea ice. And here's two ways to do that. So first way, here's our expression for the Rayleigh number. What we can do is assume that at the onset of convection, we know C, we know H as we can measure it. These are just constant material parameters. And we're going to assume that the Rayleigh number, maybe the maximum over Z of a Rayleigh number, or the Rayleigh number across the whole layer, it doesn't really matter which, is equal to some critical value. And then just rearrange this expression to tell me what K naught is. And the first approximation is to assume that K naught is some bulk value for the whole depth of the medium. So I'm going to call that K bar, and I'm going to plot that as a function of phi bar, which is the average solid fraction, which at the time of the onset of convection. And this quantity is calculated, but it agrees well with measurements of this quantity. So this is a whole set of experiments at different boundary conditions and with different salinities. And you can see from this that a cubic relationship between K bar and phi fits the data moderately well, maybe not much better than a quadratic relationship. And these points are sort of most relevant ones because these are the salinity of seawater. So that's reassuring because it's usually assumed that the bulk permeability of sea ice is cubically related to the bulk liquid fraction. So there's a paper by Freitag which attempted to demonstrate this based on laboratory measurements. But here's another way to look at it. So instead of replacing K naught with K bar, some bulk permeability, we now instead calculate a bulk permeability as an average or a harmonic mean of variable permeabilities, which instead depend not on the bulk porosity but on the local porosity. So if this is correct and the sort of constant Rayleigh number hypothesis is correct, then all this data should lie along some horizontal line which depends on the reference value for the permeability. So if I assume that a local permeability is related to the cube of the liquid fraction, then this data definitely does not lie on a horizontal line. If I plot it using a local permeability which is quadratic in the liquid fraction, then maybe it's a little bit more believable that this could be a straight line, at least for the sea ice case. So I think this provides some evidence that the appropriate thing to do is to take a local permeability which depends on the square of the local porosity. I think Jerome is trying to do some experiments to investigate the permeability of sea ice. So I hope there'll be some more direct evidence for this hypothesis in due course. Okay, so back to the sort of implications of all of this for climate models. So an extremely unfair comparison is to take a climate model and compare it to some laboratory data, because the climate model was tuned to different conditions. But just for the sake of fun, this is sort of what you get for predictions of the depth of ice. And the first thing to notice is that all of these models predict roughly the same depth of ice. So if I changed my parameterization of, say, the heat flux boundary conditions at the top and bottom, or thermal properties of the ice, I would get a bigger change than this. So this is really not significant. What is significant is this cumulative salt flux measure here. And And unsurprisingly, so the sea ice is a climate sort of model, and it typically prescribes some salinity of the ice. And they prescribe a very desalinated ice. The reason they do this is historical. They collected data on the salinity of the ice in the 1960s, or 50s and 60s, when the ice used to persist for a long time. If the ice is there for a long time, it has a lot of time, and particularly it has a summer to completely desalinate, or almost completely desalinate. So the salinity of the ice from 1950s and 60s probably was about this value. So if the ice is very desalinated, then you get extremely high salt fluxes, which are massively above what's observed in the experiments. So now a slightly fairer comparison is to allow the ice to go into a deep ocean and prescribe heat flux. So this is a sort of typical value for an oceanographic heat flux. Again, the depth of the ice you get doesn't depend hugely on how you represent the salinity of the ice. However, the box salinity of the ice in climate models is typically prescribed to be down here. If you do these dynamic models, then sort of two choices of parameter values which are consistent with experiments, then you get radically different bulk salinity that you sort of predict. And there are actually observations which suggest that sort of 10 parts per thousand might actually be a better number to aim for than sort of 2 to 4 parts per thousand. So the sort of quantity the oceanographers want to know is the salt flux that you get out of sea ice. So if you're doing what they do at the moment, you find that the salt flux is proportional to the growth rate times by the difference between the ocean salinity and the ice salinity. This is essentially a constant. This is prescribed by the model. So the salt flux should be linearly related to the growth rate. These are the outcome of the numerical model. So you'll see this A is not a constant. It's not a straight line. At small growth rates, you sort of converge to what you might expect, but you're going to get the early time behaviour when the growth rates are very high, rather different from the climate model. So the climate model will chuck out all of its salt straight away, whereas in reality there's a more complicated evolution of the salt flux with time. And depending on the sort of mixing environment underneath the sea ice, that could affect the sort of properties of the bottom waters, which are formed. So most bottom waters, which constitute quite a large fraction of the mass of the oceans, are formed in regions either where sea ice is forming, like in the Weddell Sea, or these downstream from regions where ice forms, like in the Labrador Sea and the East Greenland Sea in the north. So these sort of simple models that can have sort of implications for larger scale ocean circulation. So with that, I'll leave you with some conclusions. So there are 3 points and 3 papers which go into a bit more detail about them. So firstly, convection is responsible for salt or compositional fluxes from mushy layers. In this situation, we showed that salt flux was proportional to a Rayleigh number and inversely proportional to some scaled version of the latent heat. Showed that convective upwelling, which is sort of half of the process, has a vertically linear and horizontally uniform structure, and that allowed us to parameterize salt fluxes in climate models of sea ice. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, David. Questions? Neil?
Yeah, the permeability of sea ice, must be anisotropic?
Yeah.
What would be the difference?
There hasn't been much, or there haven't been many attempts to measure this. So yes, so people think that, so the top layer of sea ice is often formed in a turbulent environment and has a granular texture. So that region, it's reasonable to assume it's fairly isotropic. Yeah. Lots of sea ice has this, I think we saw at the bottom of the piece of sea ice, and you can see the ends of plates. So that kind of ice is collimated and is likely to be sort of microstructural models suggest that it could be something like a factor of 10 more permeable in the vertical direction than in the horizontal direction. The sort of only previous modelling study I saw was a factor of 2, but it doesn't really change the sort sort of overall story, if you like. Yes, you're right that sea ice is very anisotropic in its permeability.
Have you done any work on the other way up, when the liquid that is released is denser than what's on top?
So wouldn't that produce, and if it was solidified the other way up as well, or I mean like from the top of the magma chamber or from
Bottom of the magma chamber is actually the stuff which is left behind is denser than the liquid on top.
okay. So in that situation, the convection is resisted essentially, unless it's driven
Yes.
by something
Yes.
else. Yeah.
Yes.
So presumably it's.
So you think nothing will happen?
Well, presumably compaction and stuff like that might happen, but it seems like convection can't happen in those situations. In the inner core, people
The inner
think
core
that
is
light
the-
elements are
Yeah,
being
no,
released.
the
in
inner
those
core, you're
regions,
right.
so then the sign is the right way.
It's a lot of the crystallization on the floors of magma chambers. What you're left with is something which is iron rich, which is therefore heavier than
Yeah.
stuff on top.
What's the magnitude of the Rayleigh number you're getting in sea ice?
Yes, so that's a good question. So there have been attempts to measure sea ice in the field, so if you use one of these bulk permeability formulae, you predict Rayleigh numbers which are order 100. But it's very sensitive to what you put in about the permeability of the ice. So these field experiments were quite novel. They, in order to try and measure things in situ and to get some handle on the porosity, they froze a set of platinum wires. So you have a structure with thermistors running down and a whole set of horizontal platinum wires. And the electrical properties of ice and water are very distinct. So you can infer the solid fraction from this system. You obviously have to hope that your instrument doesn't affect the formation of ice very much, but so I think this MRI stuff is quite new. I guess you're constrained to quite small samples in MRI scans. So yeah, so it's quite a challenging thing to try and measure these things in situ. So based on that, something like 10 to 100 seem typical Rayleigh numbers across the whole thing. In a core, the estimates are rather more uncertain.
Many orders of magnitude. Any further questions? No, can we thank David once again, and we have a tea break now for 15 minutes, and there may even be tea outside.